This investigation is sponsored by Wondrium. Hey fellow seekers, I'm Mr. Mythos. In the year 1937, at a gasworks laboratory in Paris, a chemical engineer named Jacques Bergier was working late and alone when he was approached by a shadowy figure who'd come bearing a message as timely as it was terrifying. It was a warning that concerned the physicist Bergier worked under, Dr. André Elbrenner, and specifically Elbrenner's experimental work in nuclear physics. 5 years before the start of the Manhattan Project and 8 before the first nuclear weapons test, this mysterious person informed Bergier that it was possible to extract dangerous amounts of energy from tiny pieces of matter, and that these atomic secrets, which modern science was on the brink of unleashing, had long been known to the alchemical masters of the past. And this messenger was one of them. He was the alchemist Fulcanelli, and at the time of this meeting, Fulcanelli would have been almost 100 years old. And for decades after, many other witnesses would claim to have met and interacted with him. Skeptics may argue that's impossible, to which the alchemists say, "Hold my elixir," because not only did Fulcanelli appear to have achieved immortality, but he changed, physically. Through careful study, experimentation, and committed esoteric ritual, this modern master, who many call the Last Alchemist, is said to have broken through the laws of reality and involved himself in some of the most crucial events of our time. But before we dive in, some of you may remember that today's sponsor, Wondrium, is near and dear to my heart because they were what originally sparked my passion for history, mythology, and mysticism. Formerly known as the Great Courses, Wondrium offers educational content that's still unmatched in terms of quality and enjoyability, with topics ranging from the lost worlds of South America to the real history of secret societies. If you've ever wondered about something, Wondrium is where you'll find answers. Their documentaries, lectures, and travel logs are all thoroughly researched and presented by world-class experts who make every topic so fascinating. I recently watched their series The Pagan World, and I was stunned to learn some of the inner workings of ancient Greece's secret cults, also known as mystery schools. In fact, when I learned just how prominent obscenities like perverted jokes, satirical roasts, and nakedness were in these sacred traditions, my mind was blown. Explicit vulgar comedy was clearly spiritual to many mystery religions, which definitely made me rethink how values changed through history. Wondrium's growing content library continues to inspire this relentless seeker of knowledge, and I wish the same to you. Wondrium is offering all my viewers a free trial. Go to wondrium.com/MrMythos or click my link in the description to start your free trial today. Thanks again to Wondrium. It's time to mix some elixirs and discover the infamous French alchemist who some believe survived long past his expiration date, among rumors of even wilder miracles. Immortality is achievable, or so the legends of alchemy tell. It requires a specific liquid known as the Elixir of Life that forever changes the person who consumes it, and it only takes one drop. With versions of the Elixir of Life found in the histories, mythologies, and religious beliefs of ancient Mesopotamia, India, Japan, and China, the belief is at least 4,000 years old. And as for who's tasted the elixir in that time, it's widely believed the 20th century French alchemist Fulcanelli was among them. One of the things that often surprise people when they learn of Fulcanelli is his historical recency. Years after modern chemistry had sentenced alchemy, its predecessor, to outdated antiquity, Fulcanelli carried on the tradition through the 20th century and labored toward its supernatural aims. This has led many to refer to him as the Last Alchemist, and for the last of a dying breed, he did what true masters of the art do. According to Sean Martin, the author of Alchemy and Alchemist, quote, Fulcanelli was thought to have been the only practitioner of the art to succeed in finding the Philosopher's Stone in the 20th century, end quote. The Philosopher's Stone is famous for its alleged ability to transmute base metals such as lead into gold. It's also believed to be the key ingredient in the Elixir of Life. Despite Fulcanelli's relative immediacy, however, there's very little we know about his life. Records of the Last Alchemist don't begin with a documented birth date, but rather with the publication of his first book in 1926, by which point he was not only an older man in his 80s, but had already disappeared. So even from the outset, Fulcanelli was an enigma. If you've seen my previous video on the rather infamous Immortal Alchemist, the Count of Saint Germain, I'll say right off the bat, we've been spoiled. Because in contrast to the Count, whose life we have a great deal of concrete evidence for and verifiable information, the master alchemist Fulcanelli dances through the history books like an apparition. Part history, part legend, and part conspiracy theory. Some revere him as an immortal alchemist, and others believe he was an elaborate hoax perpetrated by a small cast of rather eccentric suspects. But don't let the question of his identity diminish the fact that the few pieces of tangible evidence he left the world confirm that a genuine master was at work, without a doubt. The knowledge of this master was real enough to trigger an official search for him by the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the American CIA. They viewed Fulcanelli's advanced knowledge of nuclear weaponry as a threat to national security, and of course, they'd never find him. Other than alchemy, obscurity seemed to be what he was best at. From what we know, Fulcanelli was the archetype of a humble genius who'd manifest miracles only to slip woefully away into the shadows without fanfare or fame, vanishing for years and decades at a time. According to the later accounts, the only reasons he'd reappear was to guide his students on their path, as well as save humanity from extinction. So, if Fulcanelli was real, it seems he was a pretty good guy. But who the heck was this guy? The name Fulcanelli and whispers of his extraordinary capabilities first emerged from the cafes and salons of Paris in the early decades of the 20th century, a time when interest in the occult and esoteric was at a fever pitch, and arcane knowledge was considered quite fashionable, especially if you happened to be under the tutelage of a great hidden master. Such a claim would be made by two individuals, Eugène Canseliet and Julien Champagne. They were an odd pair. Canseliet and Champagne lived adjacent to one another in the small dilapidated apartments renovated from the building's attic, located in the Butte-Montmartre district of Paris. Despite the pair being separated in age by over 2 decades, they were an inseparable duo. Locals would often see them together in the libraries of Paris, poring over a host of rare and esoteric texts as if they were searching for something specific. Specifically, the two shared an intense interest in alchemy. In 1915, the year they claimed to have met Fulcanelli, Champagne had 23 years of experience in alchemical work, and it appeared that Champagne was mentoring Canseliet, who was just a teenager. But it was Canseliet who'd first come into contact with their hidden master. In his words, quote, "It was in 1915. I was 16 years old and it all happened through a servant of his who said to me, 'I'm going to introduce you to a very interesting person.' And that was Fulcanelli. He was a man of another age, with his strange appearance, his old-fashioned manners, and his unusual occupations. I did not work with him, I only observed." End quote. This alchemist would go on to change the lives of Canseliet and Champagne in ways they never imagined. By 1925, 10 years later, their claims to be in touch with this true hidden master had gained the pair a small reputation and a handful of interested acolytes, including the 5 sons of the French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps. Together, they founded an occult secret society called the Brothers of Heliopolis, a reference to an ancient Egyptian city known for its alchemical tradition. Through the Brothers of Heliopolis, Champagne and Canseliet would pass down all the knowledge taught to them by Fulcanelli, who by this point had already disappeared. While they initially held the faith of their new students, over time, more than a few members found the idea of this hidden master a little hard to swallow. The sheer secrecy surrounding Fulcanelli raised questions, especially the fact that Canseliet and Champagne were the only ones to have ever met him. In 1926, however, these skeptical voices were silenced with the publication of Fulcanelli's first book, The Mystery of the Cathedrals, after which the question was no longer whether or not Fulcanelli existed, but rather who exactly this master was. Initially, only 300 copies of The Mystery of the Cathedrals were produced. Canseliet wrote the introduction, Champagne contributed 32 illustrations, and the rest was the work of Fulcanelli. Despite its meager first print run, the book would eventually become a sensation, as did its 1929 follow-up, Dwellings of the Philosophers. In terms of content, the central claim of the first book, which the second elaborated on, was that the secrets of alchemy were hidden in plain sight, meticulously encoded into the architecture and ornamentation of certain great cathedrals and Gothic buildings, including the Notre Dame Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, and Holyrood. Fulcanelli's book led less than average churchgoers to flood the Notre Dame, staring at its bas-reliefs, which Fulcanelli claimed hid allegorical imagery of the production stages of the Philosopher's Stone. Fulcanelli's argument that forbidden knowledge had been hidden in architectural form wasn't a new idea. Far older legends told that the famous Immortal Alchemist Nicholas Flamel had the secrets of the Philosopher's Stone built into the renovations he funded and designed for the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents. As explained by the occult researcher Louis Poels, quote, "Architecture preceded writing, and was perhaps a form of writing. Certain medieval buildings are believed to be examples of the age-old custom of transmitting through architecture the message of alchemy, dating back to the most remote antiquity." End quote. Despite the idea not being new, Fulcanelli's books argued for it in depth that had never been seen before. In fact, his claims were backed by such great detail that these two books would end up as sort of a proto-Da Vinci Code. These stone-encrypted messages could be unlocked, and it was apparent that these books held the key. But only if the reader could decipher the complex web of symbolism, argot, allegory, and multilingual puns that made up the text, all of which obscured its true messages. This dense, masterful wordplay would become one of Fulcanelli's most defining traits. The sheer intrigue of these challenging word puzzles made these two books massively popular among Parisian occultists, many of whom were keen to try their hands at decoding the secrets of not only the great buildings, but of the texts themselves. It was a Fulcanelli craze, but it wasn't a wild goose chase. As cryptic as the texts were, they hid real messages, and the author's depth of knowledge and scholarship was evident. Suddenly, Champagne and Canseliet's claims didn't seem so far-fetched, that Fulcanelli really existed, and was an old, exceedingly rich, and widely learned man. And after the second book, it seemed a likely possibility that this alchemist achieved the Magnum Opus, the masterwork of alchemy. As Fulcanelli's primary pupil, Canseliet is believed to have authenticated Fulcanelli's achievement himself in 1922 at the gasworks of the Georgi Company in Sarcelles, France. There he transmuted 100 grams of lead into gold before two witnesses, Julien Champagne and Gaston Sauvage. He did this using a small portion of the Philosopher's Stone given to him by his master. However, the making of the Philosopher's Stone was not Fulcanelli's end goal, which was to be achieved sometime later, as Canseliet writes, quote, "When The Mystery of the Cathedrals was written down in 1922, Fulcanelli had not yet received the gift of God, but he was so close to supreme illumination. Fulcanelli disappeared when the fatal hour struck. When the sign was accomplished, Fulcanelli is no more." End quote. It's interesting that Canseliet makes reference to some sort of sign leading up to Fulcanelli's disappearance. In Western alchemy, the transmutation of metals was never meant to be the end goal, but rather an important sign or indicator that the alchemist was on the right path. As Jacques Sadoul states in his book Alchemist and Gold, quote, "The transmutatory powder was simply an experiment carried out at the end of the master work, to make certain that the substance manufactured was indeed the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone is intended only for making the universal medicine, which is the Elixir of Life." End quote. In 1937, in an encounter 15 years after his disappearance, Fulcanelli elaborated even further, quote, "The vital thing is not the transmutation of metals, but of the worker himself." End quote. Here, it's important to get a proper understanding of one of the most essential concepts in alchemy, the concept of projection. In alchemy, projection is a term used to describe the process of realizing something to its highest potential. To understand this, think of projection as a combination of two processes, purification and ascension. Theoretically speaking, base metals such as lead could be projected into a precious metal like gold or silver. But the potential of projection extends to the alchemists themselves, where true masters might realize their own ultimate potential and transcend the one limitation that all humans face, mortality. If projection is possible, death is a curable condition. The antidote is the elixir of life, whatever it actually is. In that same encounter, Fulcanelli went on to describe the way the alchemist achieves immortality through the elixir, and most interestingly, there's no implication that it's a liquid. In fact, it appears to be less of a physical substance and more of a literal breakthrough of the barriers of reality. As described by Fulcanelli, quote, "The secret of alchemy is this. There is a way of manipulating matter and energy so as to produce what modern scientists call a field of force. The field acts on the observer and puts him in a privileged position vis-a-vis the universe. From this position, he has access to the realities which are ordinarily hidden from us by time and space, matter and energy. This is what we call the great work." End quote. So far as alchemical symbolism goes, I'd wager that Fulcanelli's description of accessing a privileged observation of the universe sounds a lot like the ancient Hermetic maxim, "as above, so below." As above, so below is the idea that knowledge of the macrocosm, the universe beyond us, provides us with knowledge of the microcosm, our world and reality here on Earth. And it works the other way around too, like a mirror image. So here's the thing, the universe is virtually infinite. According to modern science, there are an incalculable number of dimensions and realities. If a person could access even a fraction of them, an understanding of that above, they'd be able to do things considered impossible in that below, which is this reality and world. As above, so below. A bit controversially, some have pointed out that such reality blending might explain the miracles of Jesus Christ, Muhammad, the Buddha, and more. But back to the elixir, it's clear that if such a thing existed, very few in history ever achieved it. Fulcanelli expressed this, quote, "It is an ancient secret, discovered by a few persons in each century. Unfortunately, only a handful are successful." End quote. As for how Fulcanelli became one of this handful and discovered the secret, there are a few details we know. When the alchemist disappeared, he left behind a number of papers for his student Canseliet, and it was only years later that Canseliet discovered a letter Fulcanelli had written, but for whatever reason had left unsent. However, it was clear that the alchemist treasured it, folded and placed in a pocketbook that he carried with him at all times, as the paper had been browned, quote, "from the fine, greasy dust of the enormous stove in his laboratory. The recipient was undoubtedly Fulcanelli's master." End quote. We'll revisit Fulcanelli's master at the end, by the way. As for this letter, though it's as cryptic as his books, it does vaguely mention one specific event of seemingly immense importance. Quote, "When my wife told me the good news, I was stunned with surprise and joy, and was so happy that I could hardly contain myself. My wife, with the inexplicable intuition of sensitives, had a really strange dream. She saw a man enveloped in all the colors of the rainbow and raised up to the sun. We did not have to wait long for the explanation. What a miracle." End quote. All things considered, it truly seems that the elixir of life may be far more profound than any substance created in a laboratory. Unfortunately, these scant few statements are all we know of how Fulcanelli achieved the Magnum Opus. It's not clear exactly when Fulcanelli disappeared, only that it was after he'd handed Canseliet the manuscript of his final books, so likely near the end of 1922. Returning to Canseliet's statement, he said that Fulcanelli is no more. Obviously, this wasn't meant to say that his master had died, but rather it was the death of his former identity as Fulcanelli. As Canseliet writes, quote, "Under the influence of that divine flame, the former man is entirely consumed. Name, family, native land, all the illusions, all the errors, all the vanities fall to dust. And like the phoenix of the poets, a new personality is reborn from the ashes. That, at least, is how the philosophic tradition would have it." End quote. Fulcanelli was no more, because his achievement of the Magnum Opus had transformed him into someone else. However, this transformation may have been more literal than Canseliet expected. Having vanished in 1922, Fulcanelli left no clear answers nor any tangible evidence of his existence beyond the papers and manuscripts he gifted to his students. Canseliet describes feeling intense anguish and pain, though he knew this separation from his master was inevitable. He and Champagne would go on to form the Brothers of Heliopolis in 1925, and after they published Fulcanelli's 2 books, the two became bombarded with desperate requests to reveal Fulcanelli's most treasured secrets. Despite this, Canseliet and Champagne only accepted a small handful of students, and for the most part, withdrew themselves from the public. Champagne would never again see Fulcanelli, and nor would he himself discover the secrets of the Magnum Opus. That's not to say he didn't try, rather he drove himself to the point of exhaustion, running experiment after experiment based on all he'd learned from the master, but none successful. The frustration of repeated failure led him to unbearable shame in the limelight of his newfound fame. Once inseparable from his friend Canseliet, Champagne isolated himself and turned to excessive alcohol consumption, and eventually to drinking straight absinthe. This, of course, destroyed his body. Champagne developed such terrible gangrene in his legs that his toes literally fell off, and on August 26, 1932, his corpse was found, collapsed next to an empty bottle of absinthe. After hearing the news of Champagne's death, it's said that Canseliet's face drained of all its color, and unable to contain himself, he wept as if he'd lost his own father. Though he too had spent many late nights experimenting in his laboratory, the death of Champagne shook Canseliet so badly that he largely turned away from his own pursuit of the Magnum Opus, the master work, and focused on teaching his students the alchemical doctrine of the Opus Minor, or minor work. As opposed to the Magnum Opus being the mastery of projection, purification, and ascension, the Opus Minor referred to the elemental balancing of the human soul, something which Canseliet felt was where his dear friend Champagne had failed. According to Hermetic alchemy, it's only once the alchemist achieves the Opus Minor that they're prepared to move on to the Magnum Opus. With Champagne gone, Canseliet remained as the sole surviving witness and direct student of the master Fulcanelli. That being said, in the 7 or so years they'd studied under the alchemist, their paths hadn't been equal. All sources agree that Canseliet was Fulcanelli's closest and most dedicated acolyte, and had been since the very beginning. So perhaps it was fated that he'd be the one to see the master one last time, 32 years after Fulcanelli first disappeared. According to Canseliet, in the year 1954, he received a cryptic letter with instructions to pack his bags, say goodbye to his students, and travel to the city of Seville in Spain. The authenticity of this summons was clear from the unmistakable handwriting of the man who once called himself Fulcanelli. Upon his arrival in Seville, Canseliet was soon approached by a strangely dressed man who looked as if he hailed from the 16th century. This man then led him to a car, then drove him away from the city in the direction of the Pyrenees mountain range. The route he took was so winding and intentionally convoluted that once they'd reached their destination, Canseliet had no idea as to where exactly he was. But it was high in elevation, and stepping out of the car, he saw a large castle in front of him overlooking a cliffside. In the distance, a man began to walk towards him. And as the man approached, Canseliet immediately recognized that it was Fulcanelli. But he'd changed, physically. According to Canseliet's writings, quote, "The master was already a very old man when he disappeared, but he carried his 80 years lightly. 30 years later, I was to see him again, and he appeared to be a man of 50. That is to say, he appeared to be a man no older than I was myself." End quote. Though Canseliet was stunned, it was nonetheless a joyful reunion, and Fulcanelli motioned his student to follow him toward one of the castle's watchtowers and up its winding stairway. Emerging at the top, Canseliet looked out at the broad courtyard below, where he saw children playing in the grass garden as adults stood off to the side, conversing with one another in the shade. All were dressed very strangely. Specifically, their fashion appeared to derive from the 16th century. From behind, Fulcanelli's voice interrupted Canseliet's gaze, revealing to him that this place was an alchemical enclave, a secret colony of alchemists. He then invited Canseliet to live with them for a time, to which his former student agreed without hesitation. After this, they descended back into the tower where Fulcanelli opened a door and invited him in. Inside was a fully outfitted laboratory prepared specifically for Canseliet. Here and in this haven, he'd spend the next several months conducting experiments, living with this colony of alchemists. During Canseliet's stay, Fulcanelli would only appear to him on rare occasions, and all conversation, if any, was brief, after which he seemed to disappear for weeks on end. But in each encounter, he noticed that the master continued to grow younger, progressively de-aging, slowly but surely. And more bizarrely, Canseliet described his features as appearing more feminine over time. One morning, Canseliet woke up early and, craving a breath of fresh air, he went out to the courtyard with his shirt still unbuttoned and his braces hanging loose from his trousers. As he leaned against an archway, enjoying the quiet morning air, he spied 3 women enter the courtyard in long flowing dresses. And as they passed by him, suddenly one woman stopped and turned toward him and greeted him. Canseliet's jaw dropped, completely speechless. The woman was Fulcanelli. And he wasn't just cross-dressing, it was a full-on physical transformation. While Canseliet is vague with the details, it seems that Fulcanelli still possessed some male features, but was clearly androgynous and leaning toward female. While this transformation might sound absolutely bizarre out of context, this is actually one of the most important motifs in alchemical literature, that of the hermaphrodite, usually depicted as a two-headed being bearing physical features of both sexes. The specific name for this symbol is the divine androgyne. In Hermetic alchemy, the divine androgyne represents the sacred union between masculine and feminine, day and night, spirit and matter. A dualism between two opposing forces where unification represents a transcendental perfection. Some alchemists related this sacred union to the chemical marriage between substances, required in the laboratory production of the Philosopher's Stone. However, others interpreted the divine androgyne as a step beyond the stone, and even beyond the elixir of life. And just as those substances were often spoken of literally, so too was the divine Androgyne, as a physical transformation. And it was a rather graphic process, which might explain why Fulcanelli spent great periods of time locked away in his castle quarters. As described by the historian Laurenite Jajic, quote, "Some of the more obscure alchemical literature does point to this androgyny. The adept going through the transformation supposedly loses all hair, teeth, and nails, and grows new ones. The skin becomes younger, smoother, and the face takes on asexual characteristics." End quote. Artwork of the divine Androgyne is often accompanied by the Latin word rebus, which translates to dual or double matter. Rebus was said to be the ultimate end product of the Magnum Opus. Thus, Fulcanelli's transformation into this androgynous, hermaphroditic form was the direct result of one thing: his completion of the masterwork of alchemy. According to Canseliet's account, the divine Androgyne spoke only a single sentence to him, but one of immense gravity. Quote, "The time will come, my son, when you will no longer be able to work in alchemy, when it will be necessary for you to search for the rare and blessed land along the frontiers to the south." End quote. Indeed, Canseliet would heed this advice given to him by the divine Androgyne. Not long after this, he abandoned his alchemical work and departed from the compound, for reasons he can't fully remember. After he left, Canseliet claimed that all his memories of the events had become dreamlike, vague, and increasingly hard to recall, as if he felt some sort of hypnosis had been used on him to make him forget. Alternatively, a friend of his theorized that he'd been, quote, "in another dimension, a point where such meetings are possible." End quote. While we can't say where Canseliet actually was, nor can his bizarre account of this young feminine Fulcanelli be proven, there is some small amount of evidence to at least back up the truth of his journey. This comes from the respected scientific historian Gerard Heim, the founder of the Society of the Study of Alchemy and Early Chemistry, and the editor of his journal, Ambix. So certainly he's a trustworthy source. In the late 1950s, Heim befriended Canseliet's daughter, and on one occasion, she'd brought over some of her father's belongings to show him, including his passport. Heim had always doubted Canseliet's story, so he flipped through the passport carefully, looking for evidence that he was in Spain in 1954. To Heim's surprise, not only did the passport stamps show that Canseliet indeed traveled to Seville in 1954, but that Canseliet stayed in Spain for several months as he described. Over the years, many have tried to dig up hotel records of Canseliet staying in Seville, or anyone who may have met with him, but nothing has ever been found. No one knows exactly where Canseliet went or what he did, only that Canseliet's account has never been debunked. That being said, Canseliet was not the only person to report seeing Fulcanelli after his disappearance. In fact, the first witness testimony predated his by 17 years, and it was taken so seriously that it spurred a widespread search for the master by American intelligence officials. It was a late evening at the laboratories of the Gas Board of Paris in June 1937. Here, scientific tests were being directed by Dr. André Elbrenner, a visionary scientist who, at the time, was pioneering the field of nuclear physics. His main assistant was Jacques Bergier, a chemical engineer. At this point, it's worth mentioning that Bergier was a multi-talented man. More than just a highly educated scientist, he'd go on to become a French resistance secret agent, a respected journalist, and eventually one of the most famous occult researchers to ever live, no doubt inspired by the fateful meetings soon to occur. He was also blessed with an eidetic or photographic memory, which makes his claim believable that he recorded the words this mysterious figure spoke to him verbatim. Bergier's boss, Dr. André Elbrenner, was well known for his expertise, so distinguished individuals would frequently contact him to offer ideas, insights, remarks, and questions. However, Elbrinair was an introverted, heavily introspected man, so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he'd often wear mismatched clothing. Suffice it to say, he wasn't very good at paying attention in conversations. So, after learning of his assistant's gift of photographic memory, Elbrinair was overjoyed and tasked Jacques Bergier to meet with every single guest in his stead. This particular guest, however, specially requested a meeting late in the evening, so Bergier sat alone in a chair, notebook in hand, awaiting their arrival at the laboratory. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat as he realized a man was standing at the dark end of the room. Before Bergier could say a word, the figure stepped out from the shadows and spoke to him, quote, "Monsieur André Elbrinair, whose assistant I believe you are, is carrying out research on nuclear energy. Monsieur Elbrinair has been good enough to keep me informed as to the results of some of his experiments." End quote. Dr. Elbrinair had previously pioneered a wide variety of scientific achievements, from artificial leather and liquid sterilization to hydraulic elevators and electric batteries. But 3 years before this meeting, Elbrinair had turned his attention entirely toward nuclear physics, and specifically the power potential of nuclear reactions. And not long after this meeting, both Elbrinair and Bergier would submit a report to the French Academy of Sciences detailing the development of the nuclear weapon known as a hydrogen bomb. To many, this rapid advancement in a field so new at the time adds believability to Jacques Bergier's claim that it was this visitor who gave the information necessary for Elbrinair to make this breakthrough, and Bergier would explicitly identify him as the alchemist Fulcanelli. The following was spoken verbatim by Fulcanelli to Bergier, quote, "You're on the brink of success, as indeed are several other of our scientists today. Please allow me. Be very, very careful. I warn you, the work that you and your contemporaries are undertaking is appallingly dangerous. It imperils not only you personally, it is a threat to the whole of humanity. The liberation of nuclear power is easier than you think, and the radioactivity artificially produced can poison the atmosphere of our planet in a very short time, a few years. Moreover, atomic explosives can be produced from a few grains of metal, powerful enough to destroy whole cities. I'm telling you this for a fact. The alchemists have known it for a very long time." End quote. If Bergier is to be believed, these words from Fulcanelli predated the start of the Manhattan Project, the United States secret development of the first atomic bomb, by half a decade. The vast majority of the world had never even heard of the concept of a nuclear weapon. But Fulcanelli's warning was not over just yet. He proceeded to recount a lost history of ancient civilizations whose annihilation was self-inflicted, and are doomed to repeat the same mistake. Quote, "There have been civilizations in the past that were familiar with atomic energy, and that by misusing it, they were totally destroyed. But certain techniques have partially survived. I would also ask you to remember that the alchemists' researches were colored by moral and religious preoccupations, whereas modern physics was created as science without a conscience. I have thought it my duty to warn a few research workers here and there, but have no hope of seeing this warning prove effective." End quote. While Fulcanelli described a history we've never been taught, there are in fact theories that nuclear war occurred in the ancient past, particularly in India, where excavations of certain ancient sites have revealed, among other things, flattened and highly radioactive skeletons, layers of radioactive ash, and massive craters without any trace of the ground having been hit by a meteor. The sacred Sanskrit scripture, the Mahabharata, also contains some extremely suspicious descriptions of, quote, "a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as the thousand suns. Billowing smoke clouds, rising after its first explosion, formed into expanding round circles. The dead were reduced to ashes. The survivors' hair and nails fell out. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected." End quote. I actually have an entire video planned on this topic, by the way, but I'm not sure when it's going to come out, so make sure to ding the notifications bell so you don't miss my deep dive into the mystery of ancient nuclear war. But the real mystery here is what effect Fulcanelli's warning may have had on the future development of atomic weapons. What we do know for sure is that in the spring of 1940, 3 years later, both Dr. Elbrenner and Bergier had mapped out the construction of a thermonuclear bomb, also known as a hydrogen bomb. That same year, Nazi Germany invaded France, and in 1943, Elbrenner was arrested by the Nazi Gestapo, and the same would happen to Bergier soon after. While Bergier was able to survive his time in concentration camp, Elbrenner was not so lucky. As such an accomplished scientist, the Nazis interrogated him relentlessly, and at one point they locked him away for months in a tiny windowless room infested with bedbugs. Eventually, the bites from the bugs became infected, which led to pneumonia, which Elbrenner would die from. In modern day, Elbrenner is remembered as a hero for his efforts to educate his fellow prisoners in nutrition and having never given up a sliver of information to his captors in the face of torture and certain death. As I mentioned though, his former assistant Jacques Bergier would not only survive, but in 1945, Bergier escaped his concentration camp and went on to join the French resistance as a secret agent and spy. According to his account, that July, he'd broken into the lakeside home of a German corporate magnate who'd been conducting significant business with the Nazi Party, and inside this home, he discovered a safe. Bergier cracked it open, and in it was nothing else but a small bottle containing an extremely heavy powder. Its label read, quote, "Uranium for atomic applications," end quote. This was the first tangible proof that Germany was constructing an atomic weapon. Immediately, Bergier reported his findings to the Allied authorities, the Americans, but they acted extremely skeptical and largely ignored his worries, saying such a thing was impossible. However, this was an act, a complete ruse to cover up the United States' own top-secret atomic program, codenamed the Manhattan Project. 1 month later, in August 1945, the first nuclear weapon used in warfare was dropped by the United States on Hiroshima, Japan, to such destructive effect that, even to this day, it's difficult for any normal person to truly gauge the sheer horror of this event and its lasting repercussions. It was only after the bomb had detonated and their secret was revealed to the world that the Americans recontacted Jacques Bergier in an attempt to retrieve the bottle of uranium and question him fully. Knowing that they hadn't been straight with him, they made various offers, and eventually one struck Bergier enough that he agreed. This was the then unpublished proof of the report on the military uses of atomic energy, authored by the American nuclear physicist Henry DeWolf Smythe. This report detailed exactly how the power of an atom could be unleashed and controlled. Left alone to read it, Bergier's heart sunk. The exact words Fulcanelli said to him in 1937 were, quote, "I shall not attempt to prove to you what I'm now going to say, but I ask you to repeat it to Monsieur Elbrenner. Certain geometrical arrangements of highly purified materials are enough to release atomic forces without having recourse to either electricity or vacuum techniques," end quote. These words of the master alchemist paralleled the report's description of an early nuclear reactor known as the atomic pile, first built in 1942. Just as Fulcanelli had stated, the atomic pile relied on the precise geometrical arrangements of extremely pure substances, specifically uranium and graphite, something which Fulcanelli, let alone anyone else in the world, should have never known 5 years prior. In shock, Jacques Bergier gave the Americans a full testimony of his meeting with Fulcanelli, and as a direct result, the Office for Strategic Services, the forerunner of the American CIA, initiated an immediate, extensive search for the alchemist. They stated that apprehending him was essential for the safety of the world and the Allied cause, and that it was truly disturbing that some unknown person had knowledge of nuclear weapons in 1937. However, perhaps even more disturbing was a hidden reality reported by the journalist Louis Poels. Quote, "Leading up to the bombing of Hiroshima, the Americans were paying fabulous prices for any manuscripts or documents dealing with alchemy." End quote. Moreover, the American Office for Strategic Services may have already had Fulcanelli on their wanted list long before Bergier gave his testimony. After these events, the researcher Kenneth Rayner Johnson interviewed the modern alchemist Frater Albertus, who'd been a close contact of Fulcanelli's surviving student, Eugène Canseliet. As Johnson recounts in his book, The Fulcanelli Phenomenon, quote, "Frater Albertus says that the reason the Office for Strategic Services launched a search for Fulcanelli and are still seeking him is not simply because of his advanced knowledge of alchemy, but because he is rumored to possess a manuscript by Roger Bacon giving the formulae for nuclear fission and fusion. Bacon, says Albertus, made a reference in his writings to a certain material from which an explosive can be made that can destroy an entire army or city with a blinding flash." End quote. While others have claimed to have met Fulcanelli, none compare in the depth and historical possibility of the two encounters experienced by Eugène Canseliet and Jacques Bergier. So if Fulcanelli was alive as late as 1954, the date given in Canseliet's account, the question is simple. Might Fulcanelli still be alive to this day? Well, as close as we can get, maybe the year 1978. The occult scholar and historian David Oveson related details of a meeting he had in Florence, Italy in 1978 with an elderly man he refers to as a master alchemist. Oveson recalls that during the course of the conversation, this master suddenly asked him if he knew Fulcanelli. Surprised by the question, Oveson simply said that he assumed Fulcanelli was long dead. The elderly master then cracked a smile and responded, quote, "Oh, I do not think that is the case at all. Fulcanelli is alive. Fulcanelli is even older than me, yet he is still alive. He lives here in Florence. I have met him. I meet him from time to time. Fulcanelli is far wiser than most of his readers know. One day some scholar will claim that they have finally discovered who Fulcanelli was, but that scholar will be wrong." End quote. In the history, literature, and lore of alchemy, secrecy is a very apparent theme. For example, Chinese alchemists would repeat this maxim from ancient times, quote, "Beware, do not allow even an insect to be in the room where you are working." End quote. It was more than simply guarding trade secrets. Alchemists would labor to keep their knowledge hidden, believing that the potential power of their art was so great that it must only be accessed by true adepts. The use of dense symbolism and allegory was just the baseline. Alchemists were among the first pioneers of cryptography, encrypting their texts with sophisticated ciphers and even completely invented languages, some of which remain uncracked to this day, such as the famous Voynich manuscript. Fulcanelli's own name is an example of deliberate encryption. The most agreed upon theory is that it's a play on words, and specifically a reference to Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, with Fulcanelli meaning Little Vulcan. There's significant meaning embedded in this. Vulcan is the Roman god of fire, the creative fire of metalworking, as well as the destructive fire of volcanoes. In fact, Vulcan is where the word volcano comes from. And it's not hard to see the ties between volcanoes and metalworking, as metallurgy requires a furnace, an enclosed, superheated chamber which we can easily liken to a little volcano. Thus, the name Little Vulcan paints an image so essential to alchemists. That of the fiery laboratory furnace, the place where the brand new alchemist first discovers the transformative properties of metal, and where the eventual master will someday observe the first sign of the Magnum Opus. As stated by the occult scholar David Oveson, quote, "The alchemist insisted that one must pass one's thinking through the furnace many times." End quote. We might recall that Canseliet mentioned that Fulcanelli's pocketbook had been browned as a result of him laboring for years, day after day, at the massive furnace in his personal laboratory. Thus, Fulcanelli's name seems to have encoded something of immense significance to him, and a perfect example of how alchemical secrets may be hidden and revealed. But on the topic of names, it's worth pondering why countless alchemical manuscripts have been attributed to legendary or historical figures, or even completely fictional pseudonyms like Fulcanelli, despite the extensive labor these alchemists took in order to research and compile such vast swaths of information. Some of these works are so impressive, they imply not only the author's sheer brilliance, but the sum of their entire life's work. This tradition, known as pseudepigraphy, was practiced so widely that we might even say it was part of the alchemist's creed. Like countless other famous alchemists, Fulcanelli never once revealed his true identity. However, his student Eugène Canseliet did reveal some odd details of Fulcanelli's reasoning for this. Quote, "The master expressed his absolute and unshakable resolve to keep his real identity in the background. He judged it necessary to keep the anonymity, which he had always observed, more perhaps from natural inclination than from strict regard for the rule of secrecy." End quote. That's a bit interesting if you think about it. Canseliet admitted that Fulcanelli hid his identity for personal reasons, as opposed to alchemic tradition. While it's possible that he could have just been introverted, might there be more to the picture? What if there was a reason Fulcanelli didn't, or couldn't, reveal who he was? It's possible that Fulcanelli is someone we've already met. In fact, fingers seem to point toward two suspects in particular. While we know Fulcanelli published 2 books, a third book, titled End of the World's Glory, is said to exist, and his handwritten pages were left with his most devoted student, Eugène Canseliet, who decided that it should remain unpublished. That's a bit suspicious, for sure. Thus, it's no surprise that Canseliet is the first person most suspect to be the man behind the curtain, the master alchemist's true identity, especially when the vast majority of information we know of Fulcanelli came directly from Canseliet. As for the motive, many argue that Canseliet had originally set out to follow the ways of the great alchemists before him, abiding by the ancient creed of pseudepigraphy. Over time, however, he came to recognize the influence and power of his fictional master's reputation, and thus turned toward using it to increase his own status and prestige, and maximize the allure of his teachings. If this was the reality, clearly this strategy worked. That said, the Canseliet theory is easy to debunk. Looking at the 2 books published by Fulcanelli, one thing becomes incredibly clear. Whoever Fulcanelli was, he was an extremely educated man. His writings draw from multiple fields of study and demonstrate proficiencies in an extensive range of disciplines. And not only is the content of the 2 books evidence of this, but the content itself is encoded with multiple layers of wordplay, replete with Greek and Latin puns that show a fluency in both languages, metaphors that draw from obscure esoteric lore, and subtle references to ancient alchemical symbols and beliefs. Clearly, this person was not only gifted in their intelligence and creativity, but had lived long enough on this earth to expose themselves to such an amount of information, let alone absorb and understand it. When the first book was written, Canseliet would have been in his early to mid-20s. Simply put, this man was far too young to have authored or even imitated a work of such wide-ranging scholarship. Moreover, there's a clear difference in the writing style of the introductions written by Canseliet compared to the rest of the book's contents. As Jacques Sadoul, the author of Alchemist and Gold, states, quote, "As regards the proof, there can be no doubt whatsoever that the writings do not come from the same pen." End quote. So, while he's often accused prematurely, most scholars agree that Eugène Canseliet is off the list. However, this brings us to his older companion, Julien Champagne. If you Google the name Fulcanelli, you'll quickly be met by the image of a man with spectacles, hound dog eyes, and a drooping French bohemian-style mustache. This portrait is so commonly associated with the name Fulcanelli that it might easily come off as a painting of the great master himself. And according to some sources, this might not be far from the truth. As I've shown it earlier in this video, you might already know this is a painting of Julien Champagne, the talented but perpetually poverty-stricken artist and the mentor of Eugène Canseliet. But the reason why many consider it a picture of Fulcanelli is due to the testimony of the Egyptologist and mystic R.A. Schwalla de Lubitsch. Schwalla is one of the few to seriously claim to have met Fulcanelli in person, as he recounted, quote, "I came in touch with the man quite naturally, as we were frequenting the same cafe. This was before the First World War. I never took a liking to Fulcanelli, but he was the only one in Paris I could talk to about the alchemical work. He had a few disciples of sorts, Eugène Canseliet, of course, who never left his side. He was a very strange fellow, a prankster, and he lived the Fulcanelli intrigue in all its details." End quote. Schwalla went on to claim that during one of their meetings, the alchemist allowed the Egyptologist to make a sketch of him. Admittedly, this seems both unlikely and quite out of character for Fulcanelli, but stick around because Schwalla's story gets even stranger. As you may have guessed, his sketch shows a striking resemblance to the appearance of one Julien Champagne. But the thing is, Schwalla never met Champagne. He only met and knew a man who called himself Fulcanelli. Schwalla also claimed that Fulcanelli died in 1932, which happens to be the same year as Champagne. But where did he get this information? Well, apparently it was firsthand. Schwalla witnessed the alchemist on his deathbed, and it was a gruesome scene. Quote, "Fulcanelli was already sick when he came here last time, limping somewhat and complaining of circulatory problems. 6 weeks later, he wrote me a line announcing a meeting. When I arrived, he was turning black and he could barely speak. He was dead the next morning." End quote. According to Schwalla, the cause of Fulcanelli's fatal condition and the distinct blackening of his skin was his so-called master's countless failed experiments. Specifically, it was his attempts to transmute lead into gold. Interestingly, not only does Schwalla assert that Fulcanelli was a false master and failed alchemist, but that he was a plagiarizer as well. According to Schwalla, quote, "I had been working on a book with detailed proof through the structural elements of the cathedrals that they were a Christian expression of the Hermetic alchemical work. When I showed Fulcanelli the manuscript, he asked to borrow it for a few days. It took me a long time to get the manuscript back, and when he did return it, his opinion was that it revealed too much, and the publication was bound to lead me to adverse consequences. Then, in 1926, I find out about the publication of The Mystery of the Cathedrals. It was completely based on my work." End quote. As odd and inflammatory as R.A. Schwalla's account was, he wasn't the only person to draw a connection between Champagne and Fulcanelli. The other was the original publisher of Fulcanelli's books, a man named Jean Schmidt. In his testimony, Schmidt claimed that 1 month before Eugène Canseliet approached him with the manuscript, he'd met another man with a striking mustache who didn't give his name despite entering a long conversation with the publisher. What was so striking to him was how passionate this man was about two specific things: alchemical architecture and various forms of coded language. A month later, when Canseliet provided Schmidt with Fulcanelli's first manuscript for printing, he stated that the author, Fulcanelli, wished to remain anonymous. This, of course, piqued Schmidt's curiosity, so as soon as Canseliet left, Schmidt flipped through the manuscript's pages. According to his account, quote, "I perused the manuscript to find that it bore the same speech patterns of the words of my mysterious earlier visitor. The cryptic language, the slang, the relationship of Gothic architecture to Hermetic alchemy." End quote. When Canseliet returned to the publisher, this time he was accompanied by Champagne, who'd come to sign the drawings he'd made for the book. Though it was hard for the publisher to recognize a man he may or may not have seen a month ago, an odd detail confirmed his suspicion. Schmidt stated, quote, "Although the illustrator appeared to be treated as a collaborator without any literary responsibility, I was surprised to note that in my presence, Monsieur Canseliet showed him extraordinary respect and admiration, addressing him 1 minute as master, the next my master, when simply talking to him." End quote. This wholly convinced Schmidt that Fulcanelli and Champagne were one and the same. So with Champagne under the microscope, let's take a closer look at who exactly this Frenchman was. Julien Champagne was a rather eccentric individual. He'd eat only 1 meal a day and sleep fully clothed in his daily attire. He also had a unique hatred of electric lighting, but loved to stay up late at night, so he'd wade his way through the darkness using a paraffin lamp with a magnifying glass attached to it, which projected the beam outward like a miniature lighthouse. Champagne also had a reputation as a practical joker with a wry sense of humor. For example, one of his hobbies while attending the School of the Fine Arts was forging fake illuminated manuscripts and getting his fellow students and even teachers to believe they were real. He'd use ink mixed with a small amount of acid to slightly damage the paper and make his creations appear far older than they were. He was an expert calligrapher, even as a student. And according to his sister, he'd been practicing alchemy seriously since he was a young teen, and by adulthood, he was well-read in a vast amount of esoteric literature. Champagne was clearly gifted in his intelligence and abilities, and for the most part, he appears to closely fit the Fulcanelli profile. Moreover, some researchers compared handwriting samples taken from Champagne and Fulcanelli and argue that they bear a noticeable resemblance to one another, though they're not a perfect match. Bigger issues with this theory emerge when we consider Champagne's personality. Compared to Fulcanelli, who was remarkably subtle in how he expressed himself in his writings, Champagne was a rather extravagant and colorful individual. He boasted a huge mustache and was known to make funny faces at people, and was overly paranoid of left-handed occultism, that is, the dark path of magic, something which he frequently warned his friends about. And where Fulcanelli's work reflects an author with great restraint and discipline, something required of a master alchemist, Champagne was the opposite. He was terrible with money and lived in lifelong poverty. He also spent most of his adulthood as a chain smoker and a huge fan of Pernod, the original brand of absinthe. On drunken nights, he was known to boast, brag, and speak faster than he could think. And in the last decade of his life, he lost complete control. As I mentioned before, his toes literally fell off due to the gangrene in his legs, brought on by pounding down bottle after bottle of absinthe. This eventually confined him to his 6th-floor attic apartment, and ultimately, it killed him. So while Champagne may sound like an interesting character, It's actually his character itself that's led many researchers to exclude him as a suspect. Champagne's extravagant energy and lack of restraint and discipline don't quite align with an individual capable of producing what thousands consider to be back-to-back alchemical masterworks. Canseliet also dismissed the Champagne theory as complete nonsense, though if the two were in cahoots, that's exactly what we'd expect. I'd say Julien Champagne is a strong suspect, but there's still one more theory left on the table, and that's the possibility that Fulcanelli could have been real. Eugène Canseliet died of age-related complications on April 17, 1982, and up to his last breath, Canseliet continued to maintain that Fulcanelli was neither he nor Champagne. He insisted that Fulcanelli was Fulcanelli, a true-to-life master of alchemy, one who discovered the secret, one who achieved immortality, and one who evolved quite literally into the divine Androgyne. Canseliet also revealed his personal theory on who Fulcanelli's teacher, the original master, may have been. Quote, "Anyone with knowledge of the alchemical books of the past will accept as a basic premise that oral instruction from master to pupil is the most valuable of all. Fulcanelli received his own initiation in this way. Basil Valentin was my master's initiator." End quote. This Basil Valentin was a German alchemist of the 15th century, renowned for his considerable knowledge of chemistry, which modern chemists acknowledge was decades, if not centuries ahead of his time. Interestingly though, even though Basil Valentin's writings are both impressive and very real, there's no evidence of Valentin himself existing. His name doesn't appear on any official record, and even his portraits are confirmed to be fabricated. Moreover, while Valentin is said to have been born in 1394, his earliest publication dates to the year 1602, over 200 years later. But the information it contained was indisputably written by a true master of alchemy. It's no wonder why many speculate that Valentin achieved the Magnum Opus and lived long enough to train the last alchemist, Fulcanelli. But seeing as how both shared a preference for complete anonymity, perhaps they were one and the same. With Immortal Alchemists, you never really know. All we have are stories and theories, and legends of an elixir that transcends possibility. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this investigation and haven't seen my video, The Life and Times of an Immortal Alchemist, we explore the mystery of the very real and very eccentric Count of Saint Germain. And if you love alchemy and want more, please give this video a like and let me know in the comments what Immortal Alchemist I should cover next. Finally, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons because your support is my elixir. I'm Mr. Mythos. Never stop seeking. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.